Seasons Out of Sync, March 6th, 2020. Our reading is from the Hebrew Scriptures, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Everything has an appointed season, and there is a time for every matter under the heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time of wailing and a time of dancing, a time to cast stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Here ends the reading. Several months ago, I read the latest of writer Louise Penny's Chief Inspector Gamache books. I'd been eagerly awaiting it, but in the end, I enjoyed it less than the previous 16 installments. Published in August of 2021, the story was set between Christmas and New Year's of an unidentified, immediately post-pandemic year. Ms. Penny obviously thought we'd reach that designation post-pandemic sooner than we have, or perhaps that the book would stand the test of time, and it might, and that in years to come the exact timeline of the pandemic won't matter as much. But for me now, it was jarring to read reference after reference to the pandemic in the past tense, to the lessons learned, to the moral failings at the height of the pandemic, to memorials planted, when I was, and we still are, living in pandemic times. Time altered from the earliest days and the intermediate months and the whole first year of the pandemic, yes, but in pandemic time, nevertheless. Not yet free of fear, too soon for memorials, not distant enough to see clear lessons. I felt displaced. I read lots of books. Some of them are set in the distant past, others in the far future, and still others anywhere along the timeline from distant past to far future. Heck, I enjoy one series of nearly 30 books published over the course of 27 years, in which the protagonist has aged only a couple years and still has the same hamster in 2021 as she had in 1994. Technology advances, airport security evolves, but the characters don't age. All of which is to say I'm fairly adept at moving back and forth between the temporal setting of a story and the temporal setting of reality, even when a story may have more than one temporal setting. The discombobulation I experienced while reading The Madness of Crowds was, therefore, disconcerting, unfamiliar. Setting aside this instance, however, feeling slightly or wildly out of sync with seasons or even eras is a very familiar sensation. Lucia keeps saying, spring will be here in a couple weeks. No more snow, ice, bitter wind. I keep replying, remember that time Daryl had to dig, pull, push our car out of the snow in the Burger King parking lot? That was on April 15th. Spring in Minnesota doesn't align with spring in other parts of the country. It doesn't align with meteorological spring with its March 1st start date just passed. It doesn't align with astronomical spring, with its start date of March 20th, 2 weeks from today. It aligns only with Minnesota's own hyper-local calendar of seasons. This isn't news to you. Like me, some of you grew up trudging to church wearing snow boots and winter coats over Easter finery, or trying to convince your parents that you would be warm enough. You didn't need to cover your carefully chosen Halloween costume with a jacket. I was living in Boston at the time of the great Halloween blizzard, but most of you were here. We know something about living out of sync with the seasons as we think they should be. I didn't know when I announced my sermon title how perfectly this weekend's rain, thunder, hail, sleet, and snow would fit the theme. I'm grateful for Mother Nature's amplification of my point, but this isn't, of course, a primarily weather sermon. Sometimes we're out of sync with seasons that have nothing to do with weather or climate or calendar. Sometimes we feel displaced in our own lives. For example, I have high school and college friends who are marrying off their children, welcoming grandchildren, retiring from their careers, while I'm still in the season of raising a teenager. And then there are weekends. Back to the calendar. As a minister, there are no TGI Fridays for me. It's more like, only 48 hours to prepare something coherent for the moment I step into the pulpit. You might have areas of your own lives that feel out of sync with acceptable, societally approved seasons of life. Perhaps you married young or late, went to college or trade school at what we euphemistically call a non-traditional student, after serving in the military or raising your family, or to prepare for a new career in a long dreamt of field after retirement. In what might be the ultimate out of sync moment in the prescribed expected cycle of life, some of you have buried your children. There are ways lives and life are to unfold, an order to things that both nature and society deem proper. We feel betrayed or off-kilter or judged by those around us when our lives fall out of step with that order. Still, because we have learned across the centuries that order exists most reliably in our imaginings, not in our unfolding lives, we have developed means of reassuring ourselves that being knocked out of sync with the established acceptable order of things is in fact part of the established acceptable order of things. We acknowledge, intellectually at least, that life writ large and our individual lives will include times and events of pleasure and possibility and generativity, and times of pain, false hope, degeneration. Our reading today from the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes is one of the better known statements of this reality. I'm fond of this passage, mostly because Pete Seeger set it to music and Judy Collins and the Byrds and others recorded it, though also because it is true. Yet I think we fail to avail ourselves of the whole and complicated truth and wisdom of the preacher's word, as the writer of Ecclesiastes is known. Everything has an appointed season, and there is a time for every matter under the heaven. We turn to these words most often at times of trial, hardship and heartbreak, to remind ourselves that such are part of life, but not the whole of life. The time for wailing, we tell ourselves, will end, and the time for dancing will come. We find comfort and hope in this knowledge. Perhaps even we find the single spark of energy that is enough to get us out of bed one more morning. I don't begrudge us this, but I believe we would do well to recite the familiar lines at weddings and child dedications as often as we do at memorial services or in sympathy cards. To remind ourselves that in the fullness of life, the time for dancing will end too, and the time for wailing will come. Not to cast a pall over a joyous occasion or to invite misfortune into a life just beginning, but rather to remind us that this too is the natural order of things, so that we might be better prepared when the dancing ends, even if we don't fully believe it ever will. But bringing some balance to our use of Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, and similar wisdom words, expanding our acceptance of the inevitable end of joyous, hopeful, life-giving times right along with the inevitable end of mournful, heart-wrenching, despondent times, bringing this balance isn't enough. We still miss an important piece of the truth about there being a season for everything and a time for every matter under heaven, if we stick too closely to the text. We miss the truth that the seasons are not discrete, one following another without any overlap, one ending and then the other beginning. Sometimes birth and death occur simultaneously. Sometimes the time to build must begin before the time to break has ended. We dance and we wail and we dance again. One may end for a while and the other reign freely before ending again. When we are dancing, others are wailing. We might plant while we are mourning. We might reap in the midst of the time to hate, love in the time to cast away stones. Everything has an appointed season, and there is a time for every matter under the heaven. But the seasons and the times are messy, not orderly. The seasons and the times are messy in a world that has northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere, where even the 4 more or less predictable seasons of the year are opposite from one another and almost non-existent near the equator. The times and the seasons are messy in a world where geopolitical differences exist, and religious differences exist, and cultural differences exist. The times and the seasons are messy in human lives, which are themselves messy from birth until death. There is a series of picture books I would not have read to you even if we had met in person today, because important details of the narrative depend too much on the illustrations. The nuance would be lost in our setting. But a bit of one of them keeps running through my head. The protagonist in these books is a male-identified bear named Bruce, who becomes mother to 4 young goslings. The book, titled Hotel Bruce, begins with these lines. Bruce was a bear who lived with 4 geese, reluctantly. But he was their mom, which meant every winter he migrated south with them. Migration and motherhood is hard work for a bear. Well, yeah, it would be. But so is growing old and friendship hard work for a human being. So is raising kids and being a sibling hard work for a human being. So is becoming an adult and being a child hard work for a human being. So is being alive and gathering stones, being alive and reaping, being alive and uprooting that which is planted, being alive and embracing. We're never one role or another, never engaged in just one occupation at a time, never able to concentrate solely on one relationship without also maintaining other relationships. And the relationships are often, perhaps almost always, out of sync one with another, or one role out of sync with another role. But there are dozens of ways I could make a point about the complexities of life and the challenges of living out of sync. I read you these lines from Hotel Bruce because they remind me why we do it anyway, how we go on anyway. He was a mother to his geese, which meant he migrated instead of hibernating every winter. Love called Bruce to grumpily but willingly live out of sync with his nature. Not always, but often we accept and even choose lives out of sync with expectation, out of sync with our peers, out of sync with our original plans, because love demands it and because love rewards the hard work of migration and parenthood, of sowing and siblinghood, of rending and friendship, rewards it with love. Other times we're knocked out of sync by illness or natural disaster or political unrest or the awakening of our conscience to the injustice of the world. But even then, love is our reward and our helpmate, support and sustenance through the season. Love of the people and creatures in our lives, and the love that holds us all. Love is what led us to cancel church service this morning, though it has been a month since we have been together and we're longing to return to regularly scheduled in-person worship. Love that cautioned us to prioritize safety over routine. Our love for one another called us out of sync. Spring in Minnesota brings ice before crocuses and sometimes ice after crocuses. It is a mess, but it's the normal way of things. There is some comfort and reassurance in that. Everything has an appointed season, and there is a time for every matter under heaven. Even the out-of-sync messiness of every day of our lives, which are held by a love that is never out of sync. Amen.